Welcome to Present at Birth, ? Israel and Harry Truman. I am Val Vinokur. I'm a professor of literature at the New School, and I'm the director of Jewish culture at the New School. And first of all, I just wanted to thank Laura Oricchio, Pam Tillis, Brandon Fisher, who's bartending, and Terry Gordon for their assistance in planning this event. I have been organizing and sponsoring or co-sponsoring Jewish studies, Jewish culture events, large and small, at the New School for just over a decade. And of the 24 odd gatherings, in my memory, only 2 have had to do with explicitly with Zionism or with the State of Israel. As opposed to, say, Israeli literature. That was a different event. And those 2 were because students, and in one case a dean, asked me to do so. In this case, John Judis asked us, and since he asked very nicely, I agreed. But after I read his book, I am actually glad that I agreed, for reasons that have quite a bit to do with the meaning of Jewish culture at the New School. So let's take the first part of that, Jewish culture. So just on a very naive level, how can contemporary Jewish culture be understood without attention to the state that houses half of the world Jewish population, and without attention to how these Jews came to be there, really, over the past 100 years or so? Simple enough. Although too often discussion of this topic, as I'm sure most of you know, a topic which has surely become central to Jewish culture, turns into a kind of polemical sideshow, even among people who pretty much agree about what should happen in Israel and Palestine. I mean, supposedly everyone from Rashid Khalidi to Benjamin Netanyahu claim to support a 2-state solution, but it's like Yogi Berra's favorite restaurant in St. Louis. Nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded. So certainly, I often feel like it's too crowded to have a civil intellectual discussion about this topic, but I think that John's book attempts one, and John's book deserves one. So the other part of what I wanted to mention in this introduction is Jewish culture specifically at the New School, because one of the things that I was interested to discover in John's book is his discussion about someone named Horace Kalin, who was a very important figure in the New School. And here's what John writes about him. Horace Kalin was a social democrat, even to the left of most liberals and progressives, and a founder of the New School for Social Research. In 1918, he published a pamphlet, Constitutional Foundations of the New Zion, in which he outlined his vision of a social democratic Palestine. Kalin's Zion is a fundamental democracy, but it is a Jewish state in which the land is the inalienable possession of the whole Jewish people. The term Arabs appears once in a comprehensive list of possible identities that a people might assume in any state, not in Palestine in particular, in addition to being citizens. There's no discussion of Palestinian Arabs or the role they would have in Kalin's Zion. They are simply absent from Kalin's account of the new state. As Pinsker wrote of Europe's Jews, the Arabs are ghosts in Kalin's Palestine. John connects this to a figure that perhaps more of you will have heard of, Louis Brandeis, another great liberal and also another great Zionist, who was friendly with Kalin and was very much influenced by him. And Brandeis kind of extended Kalin's views to argue that an American could be a Zionist and a good American at the same time. That's first of all. And second, that an American could be a Zionist without having any intention of moving to Palestine. Brandeis also was channeling Kalin when he wrote in his essay, Democracy versus the Melting Pot, that Kalin, where Kalin wrote that, where Kalin had compared a nation and its nationalities to a symphony played by an orchestra, right? As in an orchestra, every type of instrument has its specific timbre and tonality and its appropriate theme and melody in the whole symphony. So in society, each ethnic group is the natural instrument. Its spirit and culture are its theme and melody, and the harmony and dissonances and discords of them all make the symphony of civilization. So what about Zionism? Well, Brandeis explained that like other nationalities in America, Jews looked toward a home overseas, in their case, Palestine. In Palestine, Jews were trying to create a society based on democratic brotherhood. So, argued Brandeis, in being a Zionist and building a home for European Jews suffering from anti-Semitism, an American Jew was upholding the brotherhood of man. The American Zionist, according to Brandeis, was fulfilling his responsibility as a Jew and as an American. This is from John's book. So, to paraphrase what La Rochefoucauld said about great men having great vices, it's possible that the greatest liberals have the greatest inconsistencies. There's something almost poignant, I think, about the childish power of the will displayed by both Kalin and Brandeis here, as Saul Bellow once wrote in Seize the Day, paraphrasing, "Only a child thinks he deserves something just because he really, really needs it." So, I'm very happy to have John Judis here. He has been writing for the New Republic since 1984 and has been a senior editor since 1994. He has also been a contributing editor of GQ, a columnist for the American Prospect, and a founding editor and for many years the Washington correspondent of In These Times. He's the author of 6 books, including William F. Buckley, Jr., Patron Saint of the Conservatives, Grand Illusion, Critics and Champions of the American Century, The Paradox of American Democracy, Elites, Special Interests, and the Betrayal of the Public Trust, The Emerging Democratic Majority, The Folly of Empire, and most recently, and for sale here today, right there, over there, please buy the book, Genesis, Truman, American Jews, and the Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict. John's talk will be followed by a response from Oz Frankel, professor of history at the New School and the associate dean of faculty at Eugene Lang College. He is the author of States of Inquiry, Social Investigations in Print Culture in 19th Century Britain and the United States. He has also published on the Israeli Black Panthers and was a journalist in Israel for many years. So please join me in welcoming John Judis.
Thank you. You left one thing out about my biography. I was also one of the founding editors of a journal in San Francisco called Socialist Revolution. And there's a guy right back there who was with me in 1969 at that propitious moment. So I'm very happy to be here. You know, 7th or 8th time I've come to speak here, never on this particular subject. Let me tell you a bit about how I came to this subject. I have no religious background whatsoever. I wasn't bar mitzvah confirmed. The last time I went in a synagogue for a religious purpose, I like to say this, was 20 years ago for Max Blumenthal's bar mitzvah. So if you know Max Blumenthal, there's a joke there. I came to my identity as Jewish mainly through anti-Semitism, living for a while in Palm Beach, Florida. And Israel I really didn't think about until the 1960s when I began to see it as a kind of socialist alternative to what was happening in the United States. It was the Vietnam generation. We didn't exactly look favorably upon our own country at that time. In 1967, my memory might fail me here, but I was so worried about Israel that I called the San Francisco consulate and told them that I was willing to volunteer. But I think it was 2 days into the Six-Day War, and they told me that my services were no longer needed. Like other people, I guess of my generation on the left, the period after that was a disillusioning period. And I'm thinking of the occupation, the continuation of the occupation from 1967, 1977, 1987, and so on. And in 1977, the beginning of a more conservative right-wing government in Israel that appeared to brook no compromise as far as the occupation was concerned. I approach the subject of Israel differently than I would approach the subject of, let's say, the United States relations with Brazil or China. You know, as a Jew, I have this kind of mysterious tie to other Jews, whether I like it or not, and particularly to Israel, and in this case, feeling a certain complicity with what goes on there and a certain responsibility on my part to say what I think has gone wrong, and gone wrong not just there, but in America's relationships to Israel. I decided to write a book on Truman period for a kind of evasive reason. You know, most of the debates now, if you get into a debate about Israel and the Palestinians, you get into the, and maybe not in this room, but in the wider world, you get into this kind of divorce, he said, she said thing. You know, who really was responsible? Did they fire the rockets first, or did Israel assassinate the people? Did Arafat screw up the Camp David talks, or was it the fact that they had accelerated the occupation during Barak's period? In other words, you get into these kind of irresolvable arguments, and I thought that by going back in the past and looking at the Truman period, I could disentangle it and do a kind of end run about the debate and shine a light on it without incurring a lot of the wrath. Well, of course, if you know anything about what's happened in the last 4 or 5 months or 6 months about my book, I was completely wrong about avoiding controversy. But I still think it's a fruitful way to look at that, to look at U.S.-Israel. But I want to add one other thing. So I started on the Truman period. That's the first period America really has some responsibility for what's going on there. And I spent some time in Independence at the Truman Library, and I tried to write about it. And what I found was that if you write about just the period from 1945 to 1950, and that's pretty much the last half of my book, it's almost impossible to see the Arab side of the debate, to see why they were so angry. It's very easy to see the moral urgency that Jews and Zionists felt during that period, because it's the shadow of the Holocaust encompasses that period. But as far as the Arabs concerned, it's a mystery. These guys, you know, why were they so pissed off? What was at stake for them? And what I found was that in order to explain 1945 to 1950, you really had to go back to the 1890s and 1880s and to the beginnings of Zionist emigration to Palestine and talk about what happened in that period and how that informed everything that was to follow. So today what I want to do is sort of take you on the same journey that I went on. It's not going to take 8 years. It'll take more like 18 minutes. But, you know, I'll do my best. Zionism starts in the Pale of Settlement, that area around Eastern Europe, in the 1880s or so. Odessa is the center of Zionist thought. The basic idea is that, that Judaism is no longer seen by the outside world, by the Gentiles, simply as a religion, but as a nationality. This is, again, is a period of nationalism. Italy, Germany, all these countries are aspiring to their own, unifying themselves in their own nationality. So Jews are a nationality, yet they don't have a nation. And they're seen instead as an alien nationality within all these other nations. The solution is for the Jews to have their own nation. If Jews have their own nation, then they will evade this kind of, they will no longer be a ghost, they will no longer be an alien presence, but they will be a nationality in their own right, just like Germans, French, English, and what have you. That's really the basic idea in the 1880s of Zionism. 1895, Theodor Herzl, the Jewish state. What happens in the next few years is everything really focuses on Palestine. There's a brief flirtation with Uganda, but Palestine becomes the objective, to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. And as such, if you see it in that light, it's, for the Jews, it's a national liberation movement. It's a movement for their own self-determination as an oppressed people. That's the light, the bright side of Zionism. That's the positive side. The negative side was that what that entailed, establishing a state in Palestine, was to establish a state where, you know, maybe about 500,000 people at the time and their ancestors had lived for at least 1,400 years. And, you know, there's debates about this, whether the Canaanites and Philistines, whether they go back as far as the Jews themselves, but at least 1,400 years, at least until the 7th century. So what it entailed in that sense was establishing a state where somebody else already lived. In Palestine at the time, in 1890, you know, about 500, 600,000 people lived. 4 or 5% were Jews. The rest, 95%, were primarily Arab Muslims, but also Arab Christians. So from that standpoint, Zionism was a colonizing. It was part of colonization. And colonization, in this case, of the Middle East. In 1917, Balfour Declaration, the British give their imprimatur to this effort to establish a homeland in Palestine. If you look in the early 1920s at the situation in Palestine then, there's two great justifications that Zionists have at the time for establishing a state in Palestine. One is a kind of imperial justification, that Jews were going to bring a superior civilization to a place that was barbaric, savage, also was thought of as empty, desolate. And the second was the biblical justification, that Jews, because of their prior tendency, because they had established a state in 150 years before the birth of Christ, had a certain right to establish a state, to reclaim Palestine as their own. The Arabs would say to that they, by that same logic, they could reclaim Spain. And to somebody who was not, did not have that same faith, it was an implausible argument. The imperial argument, on the other hand, was very strong. And you know, people go crazy now when I talk about about Zionism in those days as a colonizing, as a mode of colonization. But they the Jews at the time, the Zionists, talked themselves as establishing colonies. And the idea that they were bringing a superior, prosperous civilization to a backward land was completely acceptable as logic. Now, you know, not so. So if you look at the situation in the early 1920s from the standpoint of now, it's very hard to see a justification for what was going on for Zionism. Now, two things happened that transformed that. And one thing you all know about, and that is in 1933, Hitler takes power, and anti-Semitic parties take power also in all the fringe, right around Central Europe as well. Anti-Semitic movements become important in France, Italy. So it's not, so at that point, Jews in Europe become threatened. Their existence becomes threatened. What else happens, which is equally important, is in the United States in 1921 and then again in 1924, the immigration laws are changed. And America pretty much becomes closed to immigrants from Eastern Europe, particularly Jews, but also Italians from Southern Europe. And from the period of about, let's say, 1880 to 1920, from the Pale of Settlement, again, from Eastern Europe, about 2.3 million Jews emigrate to the United States during that period, fleeing pogroms, but also fleeing poverty. During that period, 30,000 come to Palestine, just incomparable in terms of the numbers. With no disrespect, I think that you could say that if the external relations, if the rise of the Nazis, all that happened, but you also had open immigration in the United States, the state of Israel today would exist somewhere between Silver Spring and where I live in Scarsdale. In other words, it would exist. A lot of the people would have gone to the United States. But that was completely blocked off, as was parts of Europe. South Africa became blocked off, Australia, Latin America. So at that point, really the moral logic of Zionism changes, and it acquires a moral urgency. And Palestine becomes a safe haven for the Jews of Central Europe, really the only place that they can go. So late 1930s, early 1940s, incredible sense of urgency there to establish a state where Jews are free to emigrate. At the same time, Arab revolts began against both against Jews and the idea of a Jewish state there, and against the British in the 1920, 1929. From 1936 to 1939, there's a virtual civil war that takes place in Palestine. I use Rashidi Khalidi's words, the Palestinian Arabs by the end of the 1930s had become envenomed. There was they were willing to brook no compromise with Zionism. When the British tried to make some kind of deals in the late 1930s to arrange some kind of arrangement where the two people could live together, the kind of proposals that the Palestinian Arab leadership were making were that all Jews who had come before World War I could remain. Now, I say that not to criticize them, but just to show that by then the two sides had really become locked in a conflict that was very difficult to resolve. The single other fact that I want to say before we get to the United States is that the British, who were responsible for Palestine from 1917, really from 1919 on, at the end of World War I, by 1945 had shot their wad. I mean, they were exhausted from the war. They were preoccupied with revolts in India. They really had to get rid of their empire. They were not interested in remaining there, except under terms that were really very difficult to conceive. So the United States at that point was about to inherit leadership in the Middle East and in Palestine. The United States was about to replace Britain as the main outside power. April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies. Harry Truman comes to power as the president, and he inherits this awful situation. Now let me say something about Truman. Truman, there's a lot of sort of ex post facto history of Truman that's based upon, largely upon his having recognized Israel in May 1948 and having become a hero there. And as a result, the whole history of the time and his experience has been completely rewritten in that light. He did not know a lot about what was going on there. He had two main preoccupations. Truman had a very moral view of foreign policy. He saw the Nazis as evil. He had a tremendous sympathy for the refugees in Europe, for the Jewish refugees. And he was willing to defy the British, who were worried that the Arabs would revolt and they'd have another war on their hands there, by demanding that the British allow the Jewish refugees who wanted to emigrate to Palestine to emigrate there. So, tremendous sympathy for the Jewish displaced persons in Europe. On the other hand, Truman was not a Zionist. He was not a Christian Zionist the way Lloyd George was, even the way Woodrow Wilson was, though that's a little questionable, I think. Arthur Balfour was a Christian Zionist. He was even in his youth a kind of garden variety anti-Semite, the way that, Americans are anti-Jewish or anti-Italian or what have you. If you grew up in Chicago, you understand this attitude. He wasn't a philo-Semite. And when he looked at the situation in Palestine, he had grave reservations about the idea of either a Jewish state or an Arab state. They both were really violated his own conception as an American of how people should arrange themselves. And he feared that if one state rather was imposed upon the other, in other words, if you had either an Arab state or a Jewish state, it would not only be terribly unfair to one of the peoples, but it would also be the basis of continual conflict and war. And in August 1945, even you said, you know, he was worried about World War III starting there if you tried to impose either kind of state there. So he was not sympathetic to the idea of Zionism and a Jewish state, nor for that matter to the idea of an Arab state. So what was his solution? From 1945, from about September 1945 to August 1946, Truman works with the Foreign Secretary Bevan, British. They established something called the British-American Committee. And with Truman looking on and with a considerable degree of supervision, Grady, the American emissary, goes to Britain and works with a guy named Morrison, and they develop a plan called the Morrison-Grady Plan for Palestine. And that would consist of a kind of federation with a Jewish section, an Arab section, a joint legislature in the middle, but the continuation of the UN mandate until such a time as the two peoples can get along together without fighting. That was Truman's ideal solution. You could call it a federation, binational, whatever. There's all these different terms thrown around. But the basic idea was a state that was both Jewish and Arab, not simply one or the other. And he is going to announce his support for this on July 31st of 1946. What happens is that the plan is leaked to the New York Times, who are, you know, history never changes, leaks, all this stuff, in mid-July. And the Zionist movement gets a hold of it. Now, the Zionist movement in 1946, well, let me put it this way. Let me give you a brief history. It starts in 1897. It's a federation of clubs. Big time in World War I when Louis Brandeis is the head of it. But by the 1930s, you know, we're talking about 10,000 people. And we're talking about a movement, Jewish organizations, that's very divided. American Jewish Committee, that's now thought of as a kind of bastion of Israel, describes itself as, is he all right? Are you okay?
I'm all right, yeah.
Okay. Describes itself as non-Zionist. And that's very characteristic. Zionism, again, is a minority faith, you could put it, even among Jews. World War II, revelations about the final solution, the Holocaust, everything really changes. And you get a tremendous onrush of support for the idea of a Jewish state. And by the 1946, you know, 100,000, 200,000 activists across the country. The Jewish vote is much more important then than it is now. New York is by far the most important state of the Union politically. Jews are really the deciding vote. They can take elections one way or the other, not just in the city, but in the state. Maryland, Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania. So it's important, there's important voting power. At that time, a guy named Abba Hillel Silver, a rabbi from Cleveland, becomes the head of the Zionist movement. It's called the American Zionist Emergency Coalition. It was a collection of all the different groups. Silver had a different idea. You know, Jews had always, since Roosevelt's time, had been loyal Democrats. And the Jewish leaders were simply committed, as a matter of fact, to supporting the Democrats. And, you know, that hasn't really changed. But Silver had this idea that if we're going to have a lobby, and if we're going to force these people to do our bidding, then we have to threaten that we're going to oppose them and make their election impossible unless they support what we want. He was a political genius in that sense. And so they start mounting a campaign in July 1946 to force Truman to give up on Morrison-Grady. Major officials from New York, the head of the Democratic Party, come to see Truman. Congressmen come to see Truman. I'll just read you, there's a meeting that he has a cabinet meeting on July 30th. And this is from Henry Wallace's diary. And Truman brought into the meeting a stack of telegrams protesting the Morrison-Grady plan that, according to Henry Wallace's recounting, was 4 inches thick. Truman said how put out he was about the pressure he was getting from Jews. Quote, Jesus Christ couldn't please them when he was here on earth, so how could anyone expect that I would have any luck? Now, Truman always expressed this kind of exasperation, but then he gave in, and he did give in. He gave up on Morrison-Grady. And that was the end of Truman's deliberate, conscious attempt to provide an alternative to either a Jewish state or an Arab state. Now, what happens after that? Truman has this reputation, again, based mainly on what he did on the Cold War, and particularly on the Berlin airlift, for being the guy who, the buck stops here. He had that plaque on his desk. But in the case of Palestine, it was more, the buck stops anywhere but here. He just tried to avoid the issue like crazy. And what would happen would be he'd leave it to the State Department. The State Department would lean towards some kind of plan like Morrison-Grady. The Zionist movement would fight them. There would be an enormous political battle, and Truman would finally have to intervene. When he intervened, he would again try to get a solution, a resolution that was fair to both sides. When the plan came before the United Nations for partition in 1947, the plan called for a division of Palestine into 56% Jewish, 40% Arab, and 4% UN holy places. But the actual population was about 70 Arab, 30 Jewish. So Truman tried for a different, and his Secretary of State, George Marshall, tried for a solution that was more equitable geographically. Enormous protest, he backs down. The same drama would repeat itself with refugees and borders after the war in 1948. Finally, in August 1950, Truman just gives up, and that's really the end of his dealings about Palestine. Now, let me say one other odd thing, though. During this whole time, Truman, in the back of his mind, continued to nourish this dream of Morrison-Grady as the solution. He continued to believe that that was the only solution. And we're not just talking about 1947, we're talking about after he recognizes Israel. He recognizes Israel on May 14th, it actually is, of 1948. Okay? And on May 15th, the next day, he writes another Democrat. He says, "You, of course, are familiar with all the effort put forth by me to get a peaceable and satisfactory settlement of the Palestine question. I am still hoping for just that. I think the report of the British-American Commission on Palestine was the correct solution." That's Morrison-Grady. "And I think eventually we are going to get it worked out just that way." 3 days later, he writes, "My sole objective in the Palestine procedure has been to prevent bloodshed. The way things look today, we apparently have not been successful. Nobody in this country has given the problem more time and thought than I have in 1946, when the British-American Commission was appointed and Mr. Bevan had made an agreement with me that he would accept the finding of that commission. I thought we had the problem solved, but the emotional Jews of the United States and the equally emotional Arabs in Egypt and Syria prevented that settlement from taking place. I sincerely hope the sanity will come to both sides." So there's more anecdotes in the book. I mean, it's and he continues to, at least through 1948, when people would come to see him, to tell them that that was his real solution. It's only afterwards, after he becomes lionized in the state of Israel, that he changes his tune, and really that part of history is forgotten. Now, I presented that not as my own ideal solution in 1948, but as a way to, as a history. That's what Truman really thought. That's what he believed. That's what he wanted. He was very frustrated. He couldn't get what he wanted. Now, was it feasible? Was his solution feasible, the Morrison-Grady plan? I think that the only way it might have worked is if the United States had been willing to commit troops to Palestine to enforce it. In other words, to keep the two sides apart. And even then, if you look at different situations in the world now, the Czechoslovaks, Bosnia, Iraq, Palestine itself continues. It's very hard to think that it would have worked. I mean, the American troops might still be there. But in any case, Truman was totally unwilling to commit American forces to Palestine. In 1946, America was demobilizing. There was no support for remobilizing. By 1948, Berlin crisis. Truman thought that there could be a World War III in Europe, totally unwilling to commit any forces to Palestine. So in that sense, the plan really wasn't feasible. It was not going to work. And what happened, happened. It's very hard for me to see another outcome without that kind of intervention. What about Truman, though? What can we say at the end about Morrison-Grady and about the way he proceeded? I think there's two things to take, two principles that motivated Truman that are worth preserving and using as a basis of American policy today. The first, again, is the idea that we have to create a situation there that's equitable and fair to both sides. That, again, I think that reflects Truman's moral outlook more than anything else. To some extent, his Jeffersonianism, growing up in Missouri, in a state that was ripped apart by the Civil War, that remains, that principle remains a principle that could guide and should guide American foreign policy. The second was that if we don't do something, there'll just be continual conflict there. And of course, Truman has been proven entirely correct. We've had decades. That was 1948. It's now 2014. Gaza, the struggle continues. So I think that there's something worth taking out of Truman's experience. Now, when I gave this, the book actually came out in February, and when I would give these talks, I would end on I like to end on a high note, and I said, John Kerry is out there now, and if he were to apply these principles, we might indeed have a peace agreement by the spring and the beginning of a resolution of this crisis that has racked Palestine since the 1890s. But of course, he failed. And I should have known, and it was just wishful thinking on my part. So I want to say a few things about, to bring the story up to date. And in doing so, you have to understand that I now consider myself an expert on the Truman period. I spent 8 years with archives and all that stuff. I'm not an expert on the period that follows. But I think that it's important to draw some lessons and to see what happens from 1948 to the present, and why we're in a very similar situation. In Israel, as I mentioned, after 1967, Israel becomes, for you could say a second time, a colonizing power. Moves to the right, becomes really one of the few, I guess you couldn't call it an imperial power because they don't have an empire, but one of the few countries that still has colonies in the world. China, Tibet, I mean, there's just a few. So, and what you have in Israel is, they talk about facts as very important. The facts are that the occupation continues, settlements continue. There's now, 700,000 Jews living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. That's an enormous fact that stands in the way of any resolution to the conflict. So it's not merely the fact that the Likud, the more conservative party, has ruled Israel for most of the time from 1977 to 2014, but that you have the increase in the settlements, the growth of a kind of the growth of a situation that in itself becomes very difficult to resolve without some kind of outside power or without a terrible crisis occurring. So that's the Israeli side of it. The Palestinians are still very much divided the way they were in the 30s between a kind of secular leadership that's more reformist and a Islamic leadership, which goes back to the 1930s, and have not really had that experience that even the Syrians, you could hardly say that they learned anything because what's going on there, but that the other countries of the Middle East had from the end of World War I to the present. That experience of self-government really, they've been deprived of that. And that's, again, for me, an important factor in being skeptical about these kind of left-wing ideas that you can have a one-state solution. I think that, again, I think the Palestinians need the experience of self-determination. They still have not had it. The United States, we have been willing to intervene in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza at times when our vital interests have been threatened. Vital interests in the regions mostly have to do with oil. They, to some extent, were intersected with the Cold War. Camp David in the 1970s, in the wake of the energy crisis, George H.W. Bush, who probably made the most concerted effort to bring the parties together, did that because of a commitment he made in order to assemble a coalition to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. George W. Bush, the roadmap and all that stuff, again, part of trying to maintain public support for the invasion of Iraq and a war on terror. And Obama in 2009 comes in the sort of tail end of the attempt to try to diffuse the growth of Islamism and terrorism by resolving the conflict. By the time Kerry attempts his diplomacy, it's no longer a vital interest. And what you see is that the administration, Obama, was not willing to put any muscle behind his diplomacy. And really it was an attempt on Kerry's part to pull a diplomatic miracle, to pull the cat out of the hat by using his powers of persuasion. And of course that's not enough in the face of this really irresolvable conflict. So given that, and given the fact that the lobby that lobbies on behalf of the existing Israeli government remains very powerful, lost some support among liberal Democrats, but gained support among conservative Republicans, I'm not optimistic that anything's going to happen very good in the near future. I think we're looking at a period where the only source of resolution is crisis, and crisis in the Middle East, and terrorism, and all kinds of terrible things. And I'm not proposing or advocating that. I'm just saying that that looks to be the situation. The EU might intervene, but the EU is still crippled by the euro crisis. There's no consensus there about foreign policy either. So I have to leave you on this unhappy note. I want to try to, I mean, my whole education of how to speak and give these talks is to end on an upbeat note and say, well, things are, are finally going to get resolved. But I think to a great extent, we're still back in the situation of the early 20th century. And the conflicts that existed since then are not resolved, and they don't look like they're going to get resolved in the near future.
Thank you, John. And now Oz Frankel will certainly make all of us happy.
Yes, I'm afraid that I share John's general pessimism. I don't have good news. Let me first say that my commentary is based both on your presentation but also on the book itself. And first, I would like to actually congratulate you for writing a book which I believe is performing an important political work. It's a provocative and timely contribution to an ongoing debate about Israel and Palestine. And I personally wish this debate would become more open and more vigorous among Jews and in the general public sphere in the United States. I also believe that the campaign in the right-wing media to portray your book as calling for the destruction of Israel and you yourself as an anti-Jewish, anti-Christ, Satan, and all other designations, I think is completely ludicrous. And I think it's interesting, it betrays panic and irrational fears. And I just hope that this would only help you sell more books. Now to history, and I would like to make 4 points about the book and about the presentation. First point is about Truman. Truman was ambivalent about Zionism, and I think you are ambivalent about Truman, and sometimes almost schizophrenic that way. So at times you describe him in your book admiringly as a conscientious Jeffersonian Democrat, a liberal with a strong moral compass, and perhaps even a statesman endowed with the power to peer into the future and to identify some of the lingering tensions that continue to haunt the Middle East. He's a hero for you, it seems, for the exact opposite reasons David McCollum made him a hero some 20 years ago in his famous biography, namely not for supporting Zionism, but for being apprehensive about it. You imply that if it weren't for the frantic pro-Zionist campaign and his own political predicament back in 1947-48, Truman would have taken a very different route. On the other hand, however, Truman appears in your account to be a total weakling, a bumbling pushover, stuck between equally obnoxious and disrespectful Abba Hillel Silver George Marshall, blaming others for his indecision. Truman thinking is muddled, inconsistent, and generally sloppy, so he cuts a pathetic figure in your description. And so one question perhaps is, who is the real Truman? But I think more importantly, whether he was in fact a significant historical actor in this episode or just a weather vane, a wind gauge of larger historical forces. Why should we pay attention to him now? That's a question I would like to ask. The second point is about the history of the late 1940s. In your book, you occasionally play with counterfactuals, what-ifs, concerning alternatives to the partitioning of Palestine. I must admit, I'm concerned about idealizing alternatives to the 1948 partition, as I'm also concerned about alternatives to the two-state solution. Binationalism of the Brit Shalom kind was, I personally believe, a recipe for another catastrophe. And so was arguably the idea of the federal state, the Morrison-Grady solution, and all other formulas. So I would take it even further than you do. I don't think they were feasible back in 1945 or 46 and 48. Brit Shalom, which is much admired these days, constituted a tiny, exclusively Jewish movement that the Arabs understood to be nothing but Zionism by other means. And I think we're actually absolutely right about this. It could be the case, and this is perspective I gained from reading your book, that the unfolding historical events on the ground, both in Palestine and in Europe between 1945 and 1947, rather than domestic pressures in the United States, obliterated the chances of implementing Truman's preferred solution and rendered partition the only viable option. I also ask whether the Jewish vote was indeed so crucial back in the late 1940s before the advent of AIPAC and Sheldon Adelson and all of that. Truman does not change radically his approach and policies toward Israel, even when he is no longer under imminent political danger at the end of the 1940s. There's also the question of whether the superpowers, America by itself or some combination of the UN or some other arrangement, could have imposed a different or a more just solution of the Middle East back then or even now. So many Israelis on the left side of the political spectrum, and this includes myself, do wish today for a greater pressure from the United States on the Israeli government. But I'm afraid that such outside pressure would have only limited effect. Historically, all the Middle East peace initiatives that had any significant traction originated in the region itself. This is in part why I'm so pessimistic. So it was Sadat's initiative, not Carter's initiative. And the Oslo Accord was also a Middle East initiative. And right now I don't see any source for any viable peace initiative, certainly not from Netanyahu's government. The third point is about Zionism and the Arab question. You ask how liberal Americans like Louis Brandeis and Stephen Wise, who supported African-American rights in the 20s and 30s, did not see the Arab inhabitants of Palestine as political subjects, entitled to their own political rights. It's an important question and a legitimate critique, although there is the danger of anachronism here. We now see the historical situation through a decidedly post-colonial lens. What is almost self-evident to many of us today was not so to contemporaries back in the period. Zionism initially targeted a province in the Ottoman Empire that did not have any aspirations for sovereignty or even in independent identity. And I also, not sure that I agree with you about the 1920s and Zionist imperialism. I think you were right. Zionism was complicit in imperialism and tried to harness imperialism for its own purposes, but it had other justifications. I think the Zionism, and I'm not trying to defend Zionism, was, and we should be understood as a revolutionary, messianic movement that was first and foremost about the liberation of the Jewish people. It internalized anti-Semitism. It rejected the diaspora. It wished for a new Jewish subject and a new Jewish man. So I think that was the sort of the kernel of the Zionist persuasion back then. And I think the idea of a state was something about the future. I don't think it became real for most Zionists until the mid-1940s. Before that, it was just a matter of aspiration. I think all revolutionary movement have a double view of the future. There's the immediate future and decisions that have to be made about that. And then there's the mythical future about some utopian situation. And I think until 1945, that was the fate of the Jewish state. In fact, maybe Ben-Gurion gambled on the life of 650,000 Jews in Palestine when he decided to go along with the partition. And he was, I don't think he was alone in this decision, but he was the prime mover of it. I also want to say that to a large extent, modern Palestinian nationalism has been a product of Zionism, and something we should acknowledge along the way. And again, I'm not defending Zionism. The Zionist settlers' approach towards Arabs was often, not always, but often prejudicial and exclusionary. At the same time, early Zionist thought from Herzl to actually Jabotinsky waxed poetic about the future society in which Jews and Muslims and Christians thrive together in utopian harmony. I think after 1929, that's the transition, that's the turning point. After 1929, Zionism in Palestine became heavily militarized and profoundly defensive. And ever since, it regarded the Arab population predominantly as a physical threat. My fourth point focuses on historical analogies, and I thought that that was part of your agenda in the book, that you want to draw parallels between Truman and Obama as two individuals who are well-motivated, that think rightly about the Middle East, but they are cowed by the power of the Jewish establishment. I think there's some truth to it. I'm just a bit concerned about following too far away historical analogies. I think they are very tempting, but they are limited. And I would say that the decision to support partition and the State of Israel back in the 1940s was much more justified then the total and uncritical embrace of Netanyahu's positions and policies by the Jewish establishment in America today, or by the larger segment of the political system here. My takeaway from your book, and I'll conclude with that, is not necessarily the comparison between Truman and Obama, but the rather consistent inclination of the American Jewish establishment to support the most belligerent versions of Zionism and of Israeli positions, while European Zionism and even Israeli Zionism have been more diverse and nuanced. In this regard, the historical arc to consider productively is between Abba Hillel Silver and Abe Foxman, or take any other name in the current leadership of the Jewish establishment. And therefore, I hope that your book would help ignite a more honest debate among American Jews, first and foremost, about Israel and Palestine, and about their own historical contribution to the making of the refugee problem in the Middle East. Thank you.
Oh, I'll respond to a few, but I'm not going to respond to all those. Those were the most those were the largest number of 4 points that I it was a geometric version of 4 points.
Okay.
No, they were very good comments, and you know, some of the things you're absolutely right about. I mean, I am ambivalent about Truman, and you can get those 2 readings out of the book, and people have. I think that on the, I think that he was, you could also justify his distraction in 1948. I mean, he did have other things on his mind. I just tell a story that's not about Truman, but about Marshall, because they, just to illustrate again that, you get these books now, like Clark Clifford's memoir. The first thing in it is the Truman's recognition of Israel. But at the time, it really, in terms of their foreign policy, it was not a major preoccupation. It was something. It was like a pest. It was like something that kept coming around, and they had to do something about it. And during the climactic meeting on May 12th, where they were trying to decide whether to recognize Israel. And it wasn't a question of whether to recognize it, but how soon to recognize it, whether to recognize it before they asked for recognition, afterwards, or, sometime. And during this debate, it's George Marshall is there, Clark Clifford is there, David Niles, who's a key assistant to Truman, is there. They get I think Dean Rusk comes and says that we have an important telegram here. They'd had a meeting, some people with the State Department, with the Israeli representative, Israeli Jewish Agency representative, and he'd gone back to Palestine and talked to Ben Gurion, and they had some response to this proposal that the State Department was making. So Russ says this. And Marshall's response is, who is David Ben-Gurion? So I just say that again, and this is true about Truman. He really was his distraction was partly, I give up, I can't do anything about this, and I have other things to worry about. Now, let me respond to mainly the U.S. stuff, because that's where I'm on the strongest ground myself. What was... in 1946, I think it was fair to say in those congressional and Senate and gubernatorial elections, the Jewish vote was important. Even by 1948, it's less important, but something new comes on the scene, and that is the role of Jewish fundraising, and particularly a guy named Abe Feinberg. And Feinberg and another guy are the people who basically organized the money for Truman's Whistle Stop tour. He was, they felt that they were going to lose the election. What can they do? They had the idea that maybe Truman should take these train around the country, but we have no money. And Feinberg, within 2 days, got $100,000, which was a lot of money in those days. And if you look at, after 1948, the main Jewish organization, American Zionist Emergency Council, goes into eclipse, but Feinberg becomes an enormous player. Now, he's the guy who can always get access. Now, I describe AIPAC as 1,000 Feinbergs, or maybe 10,000 Feinbergs. That really, at that point, becomes the main strategy of the American Jewish lobby for maintaining influence. It's fundraising. It's not securing Jewish votes. So that's a one point. United States diplomacy. I think that Kissinger's stuff with Sadat was very important in laying the basis for Camp David. And in fact, you can just argue the contrary, which was that Kissinger and Nixon, ignoring Sadat's attempt to try to make a deal with Israel in the early 1970s, which led to the Yom Kippur War, was also important. So in both senses, I think the United States was important. I think that the Madrid talks that George H.W. Bush laid the basis for Oslo. I think it had, I'm not saying it had all to do with it, and I'm not denying that, but I think the U.S. still has had an important role, but again, doubting whether it's going to play that important role in the future. American Zionism, am I hard on them? If you look at the Maccabean, the old publications before World War I that the Federation of American Zionists put out, you get these descriptions of Palestine. Again, and this is, if you know something about the literature of imperialism, you get the same British describing the North Americans the same way, Australians describing Australia. A desert, unoccupied. There's even demographic estimates that have 3 times as many Jews as Palestinians. There is a consistent, ignorance, a consistent blindness to the Arab situation, to the fact that Arabs live there, that runs through that runs through American Zionism even more than it runs through European. And I think that's somewhat a result of that American Zionists got a lot of their ideas from fundraisers who came over here and described what was happening there. And again, it was striking to me that Brandeis, Wise, Reinhold Niebuhr in 1945, testifying before the Arab American, this Anglo-American committee, and proposing that the Palestinian Arabs be transferred out to Iraq. That there is this consistent ignorance of the Arab situation. The metaphors with Indians run through. I kept coming across the idea that the Zionists were pilgrims. That's the word that Brandeis often used. They were the original Americans, and the Palestinians, Arabs, were like the Indians. Again, that's a kind of imperial mindset. It was true it was what. It is what people thought at the time, and I grew up. It was still, you were for the cowboys against the Indians, but that doesn't. Again, I think that the problem comes that to a great extent that mindset carries over, and it carries over after World War II. There's a recognition that there are people over there, but Sheldon Adelson 4 years ago was talking about there aren't really any Palestinians, and he got Romney to agree. So I think that mindset has carried over, and that's why I thought it was important to bring it out then. Do I want to do anything? Let's just talk. Let's open it to questions.
So there are microphones that are detachable on either end of the hall.
Good
so
comments.
I encourage you to use them. Yes, first question.
You say that our retrojecting the idea of colonialism is bad, and therefore the initial setup of the birth story of Israel can't really be judged in today's terms. But I remember learning in school that post World War I there became a romance an international romance about freeing people and self-determination and anti-colonialism, etc. And that's not to say that colonies didn't still continue, but it seems to me that the world shifted in that view, and I wondered if that entered the discourse at all. You seem to imply not.
Well, in 1917, Balfour comes over to the United States to sell Woodrow Wilson on the idea of the Balfour Declaration, that they were going to sponsor a homeland. It wasn't clear what it was the exact wording at that point. And he talks to Brandeis, who was very close to Wilson. And Brandeis goes to Wilson, and he persuades him to support this idea on the basis of self-determination for the Jews. So Wilson, when he goes to Versailles, then gets engaged with these discussions, and House, Colonel House, and Lansing, the Secretary of State, start pointing out to him, well, it's self-determination for the Jews, but these other people are getting screwed. And so at that point, he becomes more ambivalent about it. And, yes, it's a big issue. And the Arabs after 1917 are Wilsonians. They claim to be for self-determination. And there's a whole debate that occurs over the next 20 years about whether the British did promise a state in Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, whatever. But it's a big issue then.
There was a question over.
Well, they're recording them.
Yeah, they're recording.
In all due respect to you, sir,
Well, you got to speak up. I'm deaf.
in all due respect to your presence here this evening, this lecture discussion was billed very specifically Truman and the State of Israel 1948. As a member of this community for 50 years, I didn't really come here to hear your political point of view, left, right, or center, about the State of Israel or American Zionism today. I listened carefully. A very small part of your observations this evening had to do with what I need to know more about from a historical point of view rather than an agenda point of view. And that is Truman and the State of Israel. One thing I noted that you slid past early on was that, in your opinion, had the borders not been closed to Jews after 1920, or less amenable to their access to the United States, the State of Israel might not have existed ultimately. You talk about that. Tell me who was to blame for it. That's my first question.
Who is to
And my
blame
second
for
question
the
is
immigration?
about Truman.
For the closing of the borders.
Okay.
Let's talk about the historical significance, if you will, and the influences on Truman vis-a-vis Clark Clifford and George Marshall, opposing viewpoints. Who was he most influenced by, and by what you believe is the political influence of the Jewish vote in 1946 to 1948? That is what I came here to hear. Not your opinion of Obama, not your opinion of Kerry, not your opinion of anything present day. Talk about history.
Okay. Well, you made your point. I put these things in because a lot of times when I give these talks, people are interested in talking about the present and what it means. And, just close your ears when those times come. And I also will recommend the book. No, wait. I'm talking now. Shush. I also recommend that you look at the book because it has a lot of those details in it. The borders in 1924 were closed by Congress. That was American Congress. That's what happened. People were worried about foreigners competing. that they would drive down wages. There was also cultural concerns about the Eastern Europeans. Truman himself wanted to open up immigration to the Jews from Europe after World War II, and Bevan challenged him at one point. And he failed. They finally got something in 1948, but he basically failed. What would happen would be, and this happened in the 1930s, the Jewish leaders were reluctant even to raise the issue, because when they'd raise the issue, what would happen in Congress would be people would say, well, I not only reject that, but I think the limits have to be increased even more, so we have even less of these people. So it was an impossible situation. George Marshall, who was Clark Clifford, and how did they influence him?
Opposing influences, were they not on Truman? I want to know who Truman listened to. I want to know.
Truman listened to all of them, and he was buffeted. I think that's the right way to put it. In 1948, he would listen to one, then he'd listen to the other, and he had difficulty making up his mind. That's the whole thorny narrative of what occurs during that period.
Thank you. I appreciate you're saying that in order to understand what's happening in the Middle East, one has to go back to the 19th century with Theodor Herzl. I mean, and in my view, I think one has to go back to the entire history of Jewish people in the world. When Jews first started emigrating to Israel, Palestine, in the last decade of the 19th century and first decade of the 20th century, the Arabs welcomed the Jews, because the Arabs have always regarded the Jews as people of the book. The Arabs have always treated the Jews far more decently than the Jews have ever treated the Arabs. It was in the 1920s, as you correctly note, that the Arabs first started fighting back, because all of a sudden they saw that the Jews were really hostile to the Arabs. They wouldn't sell land to the Arabs. They would buy land from the Arabs, but they wouldn't sell land to the Arabs. And you could see that they were trying to exclude the Arabs and push the Arabs out.
Sorry, do you have a question?
My question is there a fundamental racism of Jewish people toward the Arabs in the Middle East? That racism, I'm sure you read Leon Uris's The Hajj. Whether Uris was just being a good reporter or whether it was his own feeling, the racism in that book was palpable. And do you see that same racism displayed throughout the history of Jewish people involvement in the Middle East?
Well, there were Jews in Palestine before Zionism, before people started to emigrate. I wouldn't say that they were treated perfectly. I mean, both Jews and Christians had a hard time establishing synagogues and churches. They had to make various corrupt deals with the authorities in order to do it. They were respectable second-class citizens, I'd say. I mean, they were not on a par, but they weren't much below. What really happened was the perception by the Arabs in Palestine that Jews were going to establish a state there. That's really what did it. And I was going to respond to this too when you were talking about it. I believe that there was during this whole period, and I try to bring this out in the book, there was an esoteric and exoteric discourse among Zionists about what they really wanted. Even Herzl in 1895 didn't talk about, they talked about a commonwealth. The title of the book was The Jewish State, but when the Zionist organization, they talked about a commonwealth, because if they talked about a state, they were worried about the Ottomans. But in his letters, Herzl says, well, what we really wanted was a state. Chaim Weizmann used to use this idea of safe statesmanship, that we shouldn't we shouldn't now overtly say that, but it came out, and it came out very clearly. If it didn't come out from the top leadership, it came out from the secondary, and the Arabs perceived that, and that was, if you read the British diplomatic reports from that period, that's really what kindled the fire, and that's what started the explosion right after the World War I. So that's the answer I give.
The British and the way they handled that caused all the tough debate.
The British, the British, screwed it up, and by the 1930s they regretted what they did, but it was too late. And that's if you read the report, the Peel Commission after the rebellion breaks out in the 1930s, they have they appoint a commission called the Peel Commission to study what happened. And they come back and they use this term, it's an irrepressible conflict. And they say that we should never have done, have defined this in such a way that the Arabs would understand that they were going to establish a state here. In the Balfour Declaration itself, everything was very nuanced. It says, if you read it, it says, establish a homeland in Palestine, not a homeland of Palestine. And it says they're going to give Arabs civil and religious rights, but not political rights. So anybody, again, on the Arab side who was an intellectual understood immediately what was going on there. And the Zionists saw it as a victory. So that's the...
Eli.
Yeah, as I was listening to really both presentations, which were really great, I was just thinking that there has to be something deeply irrational behind this. I mean, when you look at the situation, and I know this is probably not going to be a popular statement, but it seems to me pretty obvious this is a unique situation in the world today. This is a colonial, racist situation. There is nothing comparable. Tibet has been part of China for 300 years. How do you explain something so anomalous in the world today? When we go back to, first I thought, what is the irrationality? It has to have something to do with the Jews and the Jewish question and its peculiar place in Western history. And undoubtedly that's got to be part of the story. Then I thought it has to do with ignorance of Islam. I'm teaching now medieval history, and I'm just struck at the ignorance and the uniqueness, the difference of that civilization. I thought it has to do with that. But listening to you, John, I was thinking, no, it's really the irrationality of post-World War II American policy and the whole way that America organized the world after World War II. After all, you tell the story of the Brady-Morrison plan. That was a rational plan. I don't understand, Oz, why you reject a two-state solution from the very beginning. And I don't understand, John. No, a one state, of course, but this was a two.
I reject one state.
Oh, okay, but it was a precursor to two state. And John, you rejected it because the United States would have had to station troops. The United States has stationed troops in Korea since 1945. It has stationed troops in Germany since 1945. Why could it not? Excuse me. Why could it not station troops in the Middle East? In 2001. After the bombing of the World Trade Center, Oz came here, and I remember saying to Oz, now we're going to have a rational solution to the Israeli question.
I remember that. Eli.
You remember that, and you said to me I was crazy, and you were right. You were right, because it was so obvious that the United States should have done something in 2001 similar to what it should have done in 1945, and that is create an international policing force. Because you did have a reason to have some kind of Jewish presence in Palestine after World War II for obvious reasons, and you certainly had a reason to support Palestinian nationalism. What has the United States done since 2001? It has poured gasoline on this situation. What was Truman doing in 1948? He was starting the Cold War. He was not only weak on Israel, he was weak on a solution to Germany. He was reversing Roosevelt's policies. He was reversing the Popular Front.
This speaks even more to a point that Oz made. The question that Oz asked, I think it could be applied to this when you asked, was Truman really an important actor here, or just a weather vane? We can ask the same question of U.S. policy today, because I could kind of flip that around and say, really, who cares about the United States? I think one can construct a case that the U.S. actually doesn't matter. If the U.S. cut its $3 billion of aid to Israel today, nothing would change. In fact, things might get worse, because then there are people on the Israeli right who think that the $3 billion in aid are the problem, in fact.
The United States undergirds all of the...
Then why does the Israeli right, why are there figures on the Israeli right who suggest that the $3 billion in aid should go? Because they want their hands untied.
They don't want to be controlled.
That's right. So
The United States has been the center of a hegemonic global system. I mean, I don't think it's a puppet master, but, you know, you can't understand what happened in the Middle East.
I was, okay. Now, I start, what happens to these things is somebody says something and I listen to the first part and I start trying to think of what I'm going to respond to. And then they go on to something completely different. The thing that I want to comment on, and I keep looking for quotes, is the strange nature of what's going on in Israel and Palestine now. And what I've been struck by in the evolution of Israeli politics over the last 50, 60 years and the turn toward the right is the kind of warnings that Ahad Ham, one of the first Zionists, who was sent over by the Lovers of Zion, really the first Zionist organization, to Palestine to see what was going on, the kind of impressions that he brought back, and I can't find the crucial quote, but I mean, one of the things he comes back and he says, "From abroad we are accustomed to believe that Eretz Israel is presently totally desolate, an uncultivated desert, and that anyone wishing to buy land there can buy all he wants, but in truth it is not so. In the entire land it's hard to find tillable land. If time comes when the life of our people in Eretz Israel develops to the point of encroaching upon the native population, they will not easily yield their place." Now, the other thing that he said that I'm trying to find that I can't, right, but he talks about how the early Zionists were reproducing in Palestine the relations of oppression that they had suffered in the Pale of Settlement between, you know, quasi-feudal relations between lord and serf, and that they were treating the Arabs in the same way that they had been treated in the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe. The labor Zionists understood that problem. I mean, that was part of the impetus for Ben Gurion and this idea that we'll only have Jewish labor. But of course, that had its dark side too that wasn't recognized, because that meant that basically you were going to be building an exclusive nation within a nation. But that remains. I think that what's happened is really the Ahad Ham original perception of what was going on is being reproduced now. And what's happening on the West Bank, Gorenberg makes this point in his last book, that a lot of the settlers in the West Bank, those who aren't just looking for cheap real estate, who want to commute elsewhere, but the zealots see their role as reproducing, in effect, what the original Zionists did. They're going to settle the West Bank the same way the Zionists of the 1890s, early 1900s settled Israel itself. So you get, again, the kind of inversion of oppression occurring there. That's what's striking to me now, and especially in the Netanyahu, Naftali Bennett, that kind of politics.
Can I
Yeah.
interject? I have only 4 points. Couple of things. First, I think in 1945, 1948, partition was rational, and perhaps the other option would be to evacuate all the Jews from Palestine, move them to a different country. I mean, I'm thinking about Europe, I'm thinking about DP camps, I'm thinking about the Holocaust. I think it made sense. I think the other solution, including a Haddam kind of Zionism, ceased to be relevant to the situation in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. I think the position now of the Jewish establishment in the United States and the Republican Party are irrational. I think that's where, if you're looking for irrationality, Eli, that's the place to look for them. Unfortunately, I think Netanyahu is the beneficiary of other factors, other parameters of the situation. Is a beneficiary of the ISIS crisis, of the war against terror, of the meltdown in the Arab world today. Don't also forget, it was not, as much as I would like to blame American Jews for everything, at a certain point in the 1960s, Israel became a proxy, American proxy in the larger game of the Cold War, all the way to the 80s. And after that, a proxy in the game against Islamic, political Islam, and so on and so forth. Also, in the 50s, in the 1890s, Zionism tried to recruit the Kaiser and the Ottomans, and then the British, and then the Americans, and then the French. And from the 50s to the 60s, France was the mentor of the Zionist project. And perhaps in the future, there will be other imperial superpowers that Israel would latch onto. So I think it's a complex, I know it's a cheap shot, it's a complex situation, but I think rationality is really sort of an aspect of the current situation in the West Bank. And this government, more than any other government in the history of the State of Israel, is controlled by settlers to a larger extent. And my fear, I'm sorry that I'm talking about politics, not history, I apologize, is that one day we may miss Netanyahu because the alternative is much worse. And it's that one day we may find ourselves missing Benjamin Netanyahu because the alternative right now in Israeli politics seems to be much worse.
He's a maneuverer, at least. Yes, I agree. Nuclear threat, too.
There's a very dramatic story about Truman being beguiled by his ex-haberdashery partner in Kansas City, who went up to the White House and made a special plea. And according to the dramatic of that, this man tipped the scales. Is that true or false or what?
Oh, you want me to talk about Eddie Jacobson? Yeah. Eddie Jacobson was in World War I with Truman. They after World War I, they established a haberdashery in Kansas City, Missouri, that went out of business during the one of the crashes in the 1920s. They remained friends. Jacobson became in 1947, 1948 the person that the Zionist groups would use to get to Truman in order to gain entree for Chaim Weizmann to see Truman. The crucial person was not Jacobson, but Weizmann. Weizmann was, I compare Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, and you have to think, now don't think before 1950 to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. Just, Ben-Gurion was a political genius. Weizmann was, one of the great diplomats. He just had a fairly small stage to operate on, and he was incredibly persuasive. Jacobson would get him in the door, and the Negev would no longer be Arab. It would be part of the partition that would belong to the new state of Israel. So he was the crucial person.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. The next question, which requires just one sentence of background, has to do with the environmental influences on young Harry Truman in his later decision-making in life. Because you and I know, having studied at Independence, that Truman grew up in Klan country in the late 19th century, was an autodidact, the only post-1860 president to never have attended or graduated from college. And so much of what he learned was on the come, as they say at casinos. And the Eddie Jacobson, thank you for asking that part about him. The Truman White House, which recognized Israel and desegregated the United States military against the overwhelming objections of advisors, including James Forrestal, right, and Marshall and others. Harry S. Truman would use rather demonstrative racial epithets we wouldn't repeat in a common crowd today to describe both Jews and black Americans. What do you think the impact was? Here's the question of his early Klan country upbringing and his later evolvement, including World War I, the bankruptcy with Jacobson, the Pendergast experience, etc. How did that impact his decision in 1948 to recognize Israel? Was it important, or was it simply by the way, we're recognizing Israel moment? With the latent anti-Semitism in his early life. Okay.
I've thought a lot about this, and I hope I don't go on too long. First, about Truman's upbringing, his mother's family were Confederates. The father was more, they had some Union people on their side. Truman did an oral history later in the 1950s that they sent me, the Truman Library people sent me, because I was interested in it, where he speaks very favorably of the Confederacy and of the Quantrill Raiders. I don't know the whole Civil War story, but he's very sympathetic to Jesse James and all those people. And but he even when he was growing up in the 1890s, early 20th century, that area was still scarred by debates over the Civil War, and I think the main contribution of it was to give him a sense of we're in a new America where we're one country, and we can't and I think to that extent he saw Palestine as something that should also be one country and not two countries, or not either Arab or Jewish. So that I think the Civil War background, I think that's what was important. The Jewish stuff, look, I grew up in Chicago, and we used to have nightmares about blacks coming from the South Side to kill all of us. I mean, this is the 40s and 50s, and I don't think a lot about Irish and Italians, and I mean, you could get me privately. I mean, I would have that's very true of Americans, and I always, there are all these goofy psychologists now who do these tests about how everybody's racist, and they have these things where you have these instant reactions that, and I always score very poorly on those things, and the thing about Americans is that is part of our nature, that we have this, but we transcend it, and Truman is a great example of that. I mean, his view, he didn't like Chinese either. I mean, it's not even he didn't like, but they were chinks, and there's all these, kikes and all this stuff. That's the way it is. It's not the anti-Semitism of Europe, where we have to purify our nation. On the contrary, it's a recognition that we are an impure nation, and all these creepy other people are just part of us, and we can't do anything about it. So, that's my shtick on Truman's anti-Semitism, and I don't think it influenced him at all in terms of his what he did, the recognizing Israel.
Maybe one more question over here. Okay.
I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your scholarly presentations. My question, though, as quickly as possible is, okay, we seem to be saying that Truman was restrained in supporting his idea of having both Jews and Arabs in the area of Israel. He was restrained because he maybe was afraid of not getting the many Jewish votes here in this country. My question is, do we really think that the Arabs in the Middle East at that time would support any solution that would allow Jews into that area? I just have doubts, because it seems to me any statement I've ever heard by Arab leaders, whether it be going back to people like Nasser from Egypt or the Grand Mufti, is basically destroy the Jews, no Israel, no nothing. So I don't quite see how, even if Truman had been more aggressive on that score, I'm not sure that it would have gotten anywhere.
there were, look, there were openings from 1946 to 1948 where you could have conceived of an Arab leadership that would have supported some kind of binational or federated situation. But you had a kind of, the Arab League was very divided. The different countries were feuding with each other. That became more important than their relationship to Israel. Jordan versus Egypt, who was going to, gobble up more of the territory. The Palestinian leadership on the ground might have been amenable to some kind of a deal. The Grand Mufti, who the British had basically elevated into a position of leadership in Palestine, who was the religious leader, and who ends up being exiled and allying himself with the Nazis, comes back to Egypt from Paris. He's exiled in about, in mid-1947. And his this is in the book anyway, but his cousin Jamal Husseini is much more amenable to deals. The Egyptians are much more amenable to some kind of an arrangement, but the Mufti is not. And to the extent the Arab Street isn't either. And there was a possibility from about September of 1947 to February, 46 to February of 1947 for some kind of arrangement. The Arab leaders said to the British, don't make this public. Don't bring this out. They were going to have a conference. Don't make this a public conference. Let's work something out privately. They refused to do that. Instead, they did it publicly. So the Arab leaders, whenever they had to speak publicly, said, we're totally intransigent. We won't do anything. Ben-Gurion and the Jewish leadership were terribly worried about the issue getting thrown into the UN because they thought the Soviet Union, wrongly as it turned out, would be against them. So in February, after the talks seemed to break down, Ben-Gurion goes to an associate of Bevin and says, we're willing to make a deal for some kind of 10-year transition period in which you're still in charge and there'll be both peoples and there'll be a joint legislature. And the guy says, it's too late. Bevin just wants to get out and get rid of it. So anyway, it's not I guess it's another way of saying it's not an easy answer. And, I was trying to think of the name of this book to tell Oz. It's Avi Raz, I think the name of the guy is, and it's The Bride and the Dowry is the name of it.
What's the name of it?
Bride and the Dowry. And this is, again, out of my Truman years, so we're going to 1967 to 1970. And one of the amazing things that he brings out is that during that period, after the Six-Day War, the mayors in the West Bank wanted to establish a separate state. And they got considerable support from the Mossad and people within Israel, but not the top government. So I'm saying that there always was, there were always possibilities within the Arab side. There always has been this kernel of moderation, but it's been eaten up as a...
Last question, I think, over here.
I wanted you to comment, if you would, on the fact that as far as Truman handling this whole situation before the establishment of the State of Israel, that there were 100,000 displaced persons, basically still from the concentration camps, that nobody would take in the rest of the world. And this entire population was waiting for some solution, which was not obvious. And I thought that this was a significant factor in how Truman had to deal with this situation.
Yep, it was very significant, and he was entirely sympathetic to that population. And part of the Morrison-Grady deal was the British would get the state that was a federation, with a UN mandate still in place. And Truman would get the refugees able to go to Palestine. That was the exact deal that he'd made with Bevin. But the whole thing blew up. Refugees ended up getting there, of course, after the State of Israel.
And in your book, I think you said that the correct figure was actually 50,000, but everyone kept saying 100,000.
Well, they did that, yeah, but it became by 1948, I think it was well over 100,000.
Right.
So
Yeah, by 1940.
because all the Polish Jews started lining up to get out of there too.
Right. Okay. Thank you to the audience for your questions, and thank you to our distinguished panelists. There are books for sale in the back, as well as wine and refreshments.